is just sort of a group exercise. I really encourage people to work in groups on this. This is going to be sort of stepping up the complexity of a problem, but it's tackling one of the ones. I'm not yet certain if it'll be the only thing we work through in the React course. In the past, this has been the problem that we've done inside of React. But it'll at least be one of them if it's not the only thing that we end up tackling as a larger project. And so to set the stage here, I don't expect out of today for people to walk out of the class today having worked in a group and have all of the code written to solve this, even not counting user input right now, or a way to input stuff very easily. But what I would definitely like to see is people have action plans in place, hopefully maybe some code started, or at least the data structure started for their groups that they plan on using for this stuff, talking about what they plan on using. But before we get too deep into that, let's talk about what this project will be, right? The idea here is basically creating a to-do app. So a to-do application. So I wrote this out intentionally a little different than some of the other ones, because this is more like a customer request. If you're like a software developer and a customer comes to you and says, here's something that I want you to build for me. And so it's got customer request elements to it, but then sometimes they're like, oh, but I also have these requirements because of certain stuff, right? So in this case, you can think of it as the customers come into your team to ask you to build out a piece of software for them, but you're not going to own it afterwards. They want you to build it, and then they're paying you to write the initial version, and then they're going to take over and continue to own it from then on. So that's the goal here with this. And the customer request is pretty simple. They want a to-do application to help them manage their work items throughout the week, right? In order for it to be useful, it needs several features, which this is going to have. Let me send out a link to this spec as well. No, this isn't right. Wrong one. Here we go. I'm modifying this, by the way, from an existing. There is an existing JavaScript project that was really popular a while back when a whole bunch of JavaScript web frameworks spun up and people were trying to figure out, oh, what's the difference between this one and this one? Why should I use one versus another? And so a really popular thing that got used a lot was something which was called To-Do MVC, where they built a website of, here's sort of a specification of how to build the to-do app for this. Now choose whatever framework you want and build the to-do app in it. And then we can compare, how they're built out, like what these different frameworks are like. So I've taken that as the starting point for the specification, pulled out some of the stuff that was very specific to putting it on the web for now. We'll be building that into it later to do it as a to-do app in that way. But I've pulled out a fair bit of that and tried to make it more just programming language or JavaScript agnostic, not saying you have to do it on side of a web page. But you'll see that that's sort of where it came from. So they've got some specification stuff in here. I posted the link in Slack. So after we go through this as a group, when you're working through these, you can go refer to that specification. And if you have questions, feel free to come back and ask for clarification. I may need to update the specification because there might be something missing that needs to be added there. But it isn't going to specify the details of exactly how to code it. Technical requirements for this customer. They want the application to be written using JavaScript. That's really the only thing that they know. So if they're going to take ownership, they want to be able to program in it afterwards. And again, we're not going to have this in the first version, so don't focus too much on it. But we'll be building on that probably over the next week as we dig into web development more, and actually working on the front end is having a UI using HTML and CSS. So that's another encouragement. The farther along you can get with the JavaScript code portion of this, working through it today, then a lot of people are able to really move along on that, we may actually be able to build a very basic web UI for that as we're talking about how to add JavaScript to the web in the last bit of courses that we have. They also want a README because they're taking ownership of the project. And so they want this README to explain what they need to know when the project is handed over to them. Like what technical decisions were made? Why did you choose to use this sort of data structure of these objects? How do I run tests, or how do I build the code? You know, give me some instructions about how I work with this project when I take it over, so that I can continue to do development. They'd prefer any dependencies that you install, you're using npm for dependency management. So try not to use something else. I mean, that's really all we've talked about here. So that fits really perfectly. And they would love to have tests written that verify the to-do application functionality. But they don't care if the tests verify the UI, right? The tests don't have to run inside of a browser and verify that the DOM elements are there. They just want to know that the core functionality of it works correctly. So then getting into what's the actual functionality that they care about. So that's sort of the technical specs. And then the functionality is broken down, and you'll notice sort of weaved, some of the language is weaved in between, right? There's not this concrete thing. So first thing is they want to be able to view to-dos. They should be able to view all of the current to-dos. It should be possible to view all to-dos, whether they're completed or not completed, as well as viewing only the uncompleted ones, right? And by default, when they're viewing to-dos, it should be possible to, or it should only show the uncompleted to-dos, the ones that haven't been done, because typically you don't care about the ones that you've already finished. Should also be possible to view the details of an individual to-do item, whether it's completed or not, as well as the description of it. If there's no to-dos at all, then whether completed or not, so no to-dos exist in the system, then it should show a message, preferably saying no to-dos created yet, create one to get started. If there are to-dos, but all of them are completed, they've finished all of the to-dos, but they're in the system, then the default view, which shows only uncompleted to-dos, should instead print a message saying, congratulations, you've completed all your to-dos, right? Encouraging them, hey, you're finishing your work. And on that page that prints out the list of to-dos where you can view them, it should also, when it's done, just give you a basic summary of it, right? 12 uncompleted to-dos or something like that at the bottom. That's a little flexible. As a customer, I don't care exactly what that says, but I want some summary of what it's printing out there. Other specifications of this system, right, is there should be a way to create a new to-do item. Obviously, if I'm wanting to use this. To-do item is very simple. It really only has two aspects to it right now, at least. It's got a text description or title, whatever you want to call that, and it has a value that just represents whether that to-do item is completed or not completed. So I need to be able to mark a to-do as completed. That's the next point here, is that to-do should be able to be marked as completed, and I should be able to edit the description of the to-do after it's been created. So, oh, I accidentally didn't put enough detail here. I want to go back in there and add more information to this to-do item. Some other bits that I want to have in the system are, I want to be able to toggle all the to-dos state for completed or uncompleted as a single action. Might need to add a little more clarification there, but I should have an ability to say, like, complete all the to-dos or mark all of them as uncompleted with one step, as opposed to having to do that piece by piece if I'm doing that. And then there should be the ability to delete the completed to-dos. It will just delete all of the to-dos that have been completed, and they won't be in the system anymore. So for example, just to relate a couple different aspects of how this works is, if you've completed all of your to-dos and you delete them all, now that view of to-dos will say something like no to-dos created yet, create one to get started, because it doesn't have any in the system anymore. Any questions about just this description of a project yet? No? Some quizzical faces. I mean, so what I'm going to encourage here is, again, I expect there to be questions, right? So here's what I want you guys to try and work on today, and this is sort of this group exercise, is encourage you to split up into groups. You can do it yourself if you want, but it'll probably be harder. And start talking through what you would want to do to build out an application like this, right? Like, what data objects are you going to use? Are you going to use, what data types make sense? You want to store stuff in some sort of, you want to use objects, you want to use classes, you want to use arrays. How are you going to handle these functions to be able to change these states? What makes sense? And then, especially today, while you're working through this, as we've talked a fair bit about this sort of test-driven development mindset, think about, even if you don't get them written down in code right away, think about what are the tests that you would want to make sure that this system is working correctly. And let me give one hint on how to do tests effectively that I didn't really talk about, but I think it's really useful, is if you're trying to figure out how to write a test or how to accomplish a test, there's several different ways that people say this, but I think my favorite is arrange, act, assert for tests. And the idea here is, when you're thinking of a test, you want to arrange your system into a specific state ahead of time. So let me give one example. Arrange, I've got 5 to-dos and they're all uncompleted in my system. Act is an action you want to take, and then assert is something you want to assert about what happened with that action, right? So an act in that case might be, I mark the 5th to-do, or the to-do with a certain description, as completed. And then what you want to assert is that now, there's different things you could assert, but you might assert that now when I print the list of uncompleted to-dos, that to-do doesn't show up. Or if I print just that one to-do, it shows that it's completed. But that's a good shorthand for when you're thinking of tests, even if you're just writing them out by hand, is what's the state of my system beforehand? What's the action I'm taking? And then what do I want to assert, or what do I care about that? Essentially, what do I care about the state of my system after I took that action that I want to assert is what's going on.
During this exercise for people split into groups, do you recommend that they arrange themselves in a way that does JavaScript or
So today, today we're not going to probably get into the HTML and CSS because we haven't really tackled integrating that stuff. So even though I have it in this, that's just me making it more customer-like for the time being. I mean, if somebody wants to go that far and start integrating it into a front end, they can. The reason I put it there is honestly because one of the questions that will come up when you start working this is, wait a minute, all the JavaScript stuff we've done, how does a customer create a new to-do? Like, how do they actually accomplish that, right? And for now, you can simulate that in like a test by just doing whatever, calling or invoking whatever function or method or whatever the UI would call. You don't have to have that UI layer on there, but we will be putting a UI layer on top of it going forward, so it would be useful to still be thinking about it a little bit. I would say in groups, I mean, I don't want to dictate what works well, but I would suggest, a few different possibilities. One could be that somebody's thinking about tests, like in a development team, sometimes you'll have one person who's like trying to figure out what all the tests need to be, and somebody else is trying to figure out how to meet those tests. Or another approach might be to think about the design of the system first, like what large elements you want to use, and then start talking about how you would test that. Or another one would be to talk about one test at a time, like we've sort of talked about with test-driven development, like what would be one thing we want to test, and what do we need in the system to do that. Before you even, it's very possible for this exercise today, before you even start writing code, to be writing stuff out, just as text or writing it out by hand, to be thinking about, oh, does my system still work with these assumptions as I'm trying to build it out? But it's definitely, I mean, this will be a step up in complexity because this isn't one function. Most of our work has been 1 or 2 functions. This is a system that you need to have in some way. And so there's going to be some new thinking that you'll need to apply, and talking about that with each other should be an effective way to help you try and think through that. I'll be here to answer questions both about the specification or like, does this make sense, do you think, as you're working in a group? Like, we're thinking that this might be a good way to solve this problem. You know, what do you think about the pros and cons of that? And then this is very similar to some of the other stuff. What I would love to see first is start with, you know, writing out a rough plan of what you think you're going to be building, and sort of post that probably in, you know, a GitHub page or something. That might just be a text file, you know, a markdown file of what you're planning to do. And then once you think you have enough of that in place, don't try and figure out necessarily all of it. But once you think you have enough, then you might start writing the code that backs the structure that you want to have.
So how many people should be?
Good question. I mean, I don't know what would be best. It might depend on how comfortable people feel trying to solve it themselves. You know, 2 or 3 seems like a good starting point. More than 5 is probably too many for sure. I would say probably 2 to 4 makes the most sense in a group working on this, because once you get beyond that, it's going to, some people aren't probably going to be engaged. But you know, if there's somebody, if it's some people who feel relatively comfortable with coding already, a smaller group probably makes more sense. Whereas if it's people who are still pretty new to it, and we've got a mix of all of that in class, then it might make sense to have a little bit of a larger group, because they can talk more amongst each other and, you know, pull those different bits of knowledge that each of them have acquired together to build something, versus trying to figure it all out with just 1 or 2 people. And this is, again, this is just a start. We'll be continuing to build on this. But for this last week, like next week, my plan is to be taking a step, I don't want to say a step back from the JavaScript directly, but a step over into the web integration again that we started with sort of at the beginning of the class. People who were going through the HTML, CSS course have finished that at this point. So then I want to start talking about how do we tie in the JavaScript work that we've been doing into a web page more actively. And that'll be the basis for going forward into React stuff. That'll be sort of the last major topic that we're going to cover, is working inside of a web page with JavaScript a little more. This is, I would say, sort of a starting point for it, because we will be building out an application around this with React eventually, but you know, potentially we might do one before then that's sort of minimal like this. Any other questions? All right. Oh, and then I have one other. This is just me being nerdy. I've never played with this, but this is sort of cool. If people want to do something entertaining, play a little bit of a coding game that's fun, you might try something like this elevator saga at some point. This is just a little programming game of trying to program an elevator, and it gets progressively more difficult to meet the goals of the elevator over time. So it's a fun little like practice of just problem solving in code. All right, I'm going to take the stream off for anybody who's watching remotely, but we'll be online, so hit me up with any questions in Slack if you have anything. And I know it's a little more challenging remote, but if you can, try to create a remote group working together. you know, whether you're talking together just directly, direct messaging on Slack, or whether you're just create a thread in our channel. Anything that seems like it makes sense might be a good idea, just because it'll help you get practice in working in that sort of way. All right.